Welcome, everybody, to the virtual McMullen Museum and to our Into the Collection series, which usually takes place live in the museum. This is our third virtual presentation, and we are happy to have so many of you join us. In this case, we are looking specifically at the museum's expedition and Orientalist photographs. The McMullen Museum has a number of 19th and 20th century photographs of this genre. And today we will feature a selection of 6 by different photographers to illustrate our themes. I will begin, followed by 4 of the museum's 2021 student ambassadors who work at the museum during the semester in various capacities. We are fortunate to have Matthew Di Benedetto, Peyton Wilson, Ethan Starr, and Atta Chowdhury from the Collections Committee to speak with you about photographs they have each selected. First, for a very brief background for today's presentations. The Orient, including present-day Turkey, Greece, the Middle East, and North Africa, captured European imagination centuries prior to the turn of the 19th century, despite minimal contact with the region. Things changed after Napoleon's 1798 invasion and subsequent occupation of Egypt until 1801, following which the French government established the Egyptian Institute or Institut d'Égypte, and between 1809 and 22 published a 24-volume Description de l'Égypte, or Description of Egypt, documenting the antiquities and culture of Egypt, which had a profound effect on the architecture and decorative arts of the period. Artists and writers began visiting the region, and the first Orientalist painters emerged. At first painting propagandist scenes of the conquest of a hitherto barbaric region, as seen in 2 iconic paintings from the period. On the left, Napoleon and the plague victims at Jaffa by Antoine Gros, and Eugène Delacroix's hedonistic vision of the death of Sardanapalus. Later in the century, Orientalists turned to purely decorative scenes of exotic people and architecture. Here we see 2 fine examples of this kind of painting by Jean-Léon Gérôme and John Singer Sargent, both in New England collection at the Clark Art Institute. The British were soon to follow the French, and this Orientalist fervor continued throughout the century as the region opened up more and more to travelers and eventually to emerging photographers, as we will see. I am starting with a photograph taken by Francis Bedford entitled Temple of Hathor and Small Chapel, taken in Egypt in 1862 during the royal expedition to the Middle East with Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales, and donated to the McMullen Museum in 2002 by David Mahoney and Wynne Ellis. Born in Camden, North London, in 1815, Bedford trained with his architect father, and he began his career by creating drawings of churches and buildings in York, which he made into lithographic prints in 1841. In the mid-1840s, he created 3 charts of Anglican church architecture, of York Cathedral, and of Westminster Abbey. These lithographs were published as guidebooks for an emerging middle class with more leisure time to travel around the country on the expanding railway system. The chart of Westminster Abbey, shown here, was printed by Day and Son, who were lithographers to the Queen. Bedford began photographing in 1853, and later on in the decade was traveling around the country to Wales, Devon, Wiltshire, and Southeast England, capturing castle ruins, cathedrals, and other architectural sites with his camera. These images could be printed in large numbers, affordable to middle-class tourists who wanted souvenirs. By the early 1860s, Bedford had become a full-time professional photographer with a thriving commercial studio which produced album and prints, stereoscopic views, and collectible small format cartes de visite. The McMullen Museum has some examples of Bedford's carte de visite, seen here, all showing views of Exeter Cathedral. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert became familiar with the new medium of photography in the 1850s and began by commissioning portraits. The royals frequented exhibitions, including one in 1854 at the Photographic Society, showing photographs by Bedford of objects from the Great Exhibition. The Queen subsequently employed the photographer to document sights from Prince Albert's childhood in Coburg, Germany. After this royal commission, Frances Bedford was the Queen's choice candidate to travel with her son, Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales, on his first trip to the Middle East, proposed by his parents to keep him out of trouble and educate him for his future role. A court circular announced in February of 1862, quote, "Mr. Francis Bedford, age 46, has been appointed to accompany His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, in his tour through the East, for the purpose of taking photographic views of the landscapes, figures, and architecture of the various remarkable places that may be visited," unquote. The death of Prince Albert in 1861 postponed the 4-month trip until February of 1862. The small party, with several assistants and servants, traveled from Dover to Calais, then by rail to Austria, on to Trieste, where they boarded a ship destined for Venice, then along the Dalmatian coast to Corfu, continuing to Egypt via the Ionian Islands. On March the 1st, the prince and his entourage arrived in Alexandria, where they were met by their tour guide and Sunday minister, the Reverend Arthur Stanley, Oxford professor who had visited the Holy Land in 1852-4. They left immediately for Cairo, and after seeing the sights there, met a barge to take them for a 10-day journey down the Nile as far as Philae. After 28 days in Egypt, the royal party toured the Holy Land until mid-May, when they departed for Constantinople via various Greek islands before returning home. Although photography was relatively new, discovered in 1839, a few photographers had preceded Bedford to the Middle East. French photographer Maxime Ducamp had traveled to Egypt in 1849 and 1851, and his photographs were subsequently published and displayed in London. James Robertson photographed Constantinople and Malta, and Francis Frith made 3 separate trips to Egypt between 1856 and 1860, and his resulting photographs were widely exhibited and published in Britain. Bedford, a member of the major photographic societies, would have been familiar with his adventurous predecessors. Painter David Roberts had just preceded the photographers in documenting his travels to the Orient between 1838 and 40. He executed 247 drawings and watercolor sketches, which lithographer Louis Hague published in a travelogue entitled "The Holy Land, Syria, Idumea, Arabia, Egypt, and Nubia," between 1842 and 1849. Many of these watercolor sketches were eventually made into oil paintings. Roberts was one of the first British artists to paint the scenery and monuments of Egypt and the Holy Land with these volumes. His work became very fashionable, and Queen Victoria herself purchased a volume for the royal collection. On the royal tour, Francis Bedford made 191 10 by 12 inch glass plate negatives using the wet collodion process and cameras. He chose 172 plates of these, which he printed for exhibition and publication in 3 volumes. The cover of one is shown here on the right, with the complete album cover on the left. Bedford's large prints cost 7 shillings each, which equaled the weekly salary for a working class adult. Here are some examples of the type of camera Bedford would have used on the tour. Expedition photographers usually traveled with a portable darkroom. You can see Bedford's tent under the colonnade in this photograph. American photographer Timothy O'Sullivan used a wagon. In more treacherous terrain, glass plates and camera could be strapped to a mule or even the photographer's back. Geological Survey photographer William Henry Jackson reported that while working out in the American West, his mule stumbled and he lost 3 weeks of negatives when they were shattered. He then had to retrace his steps and retake all his pictures. The chemicals would be mixed and the glass coated inside a tent, as in this period illustration. The entire process of coating the glass plate with collodion and silver salts, exposing and fixing the negative, would all have to happen before the chemicals dried in under 15 minutes. Excessive heat in the tent sometimes led to chemicals actually boiling, ruining the negative. Extreme cold also caused its own problems, not to mention sand, dust, or wind. Once fixed, the plates would have to be carefully wrapped up and stacked together to carry back home for printing. Adventure traveling with all of this equipment was no easy task. The Illustrated London News reported, "As a mere manipulator, Mr. Bedford has been eminently successful. He has, by judicious exposure and perfect control of developing processes and chemicals employed, overcome the difficulty of giving the middle tint better than we have hitherto seen in photographs from Eastern subjects, in which the contrasts of light and shade are usually so violent." Lands of sunshine, the countries of the Orient, were the first sites where new photographers chose to work. Light was a technical necessity, so the abundance of sun there made it an ideal location for them. According to Daguerre, inventor of the first form of photography, quote, "The imprint of nature would reproduce itself still more rapidly in the countries where the light is more intense than in Paris." Exposures were reduced from 8 to 10 minutes to 2 or even 1 minute. The Orientalist photographers were not only able to accurately document their surroundings, but to create a lively interplay between realism and mystery by manipulating the high contrast of light and shadow. Our photograph, considered to be, quote, "the most complete picture in the series," unquote, by the Photographic Journal, documents the original location of this temple complex on the island of Philae. Since the construction of the Low Aswan Dam by the British in 1902, the island was incrementally flooded annually, leading to the degradation of the buildings from water and river silt. By the 1960s, the island was partially submerged all year round, resulting in the decision to move the buildings to the nearby island of Agilkia on higher ground between 1977 and 1980. The Temple of Hathor is one of several in Bedford's series without figures. This intentional absence of people creates an idealized document of what may have been perceived even then as a disappearing reality. Bedford's slightly bird's eye view accentuates the foreground ruins, and he chose a dynamic off-center composition for the temple buildings and the site. The island setting is suggested by the water visible beyond and the foreground palm trees and further distant trees and hills. The articulation of light and shadow, contrasting light and dark areas, gives the viewer a real sense of depth. The Times, from December of 1862, described Bedford's photos, such as this one. Quote, "Silent though they be, they speak to us in their solemn and deserted grandeur of a past civilization, a past power, and a past wealth. They speak to us in their carved columns, pillars, and friezes of all that have been great and glorious, more eloquently and more forcibly than anything which the words of ready writers could convey to us." After the royal tour, Bedford maintained a business studio with his 2 sons, one of whom tragically died in 1867. To boost prestige, he had his carte de visite emblazoned with a stamp, "Photographer to the Prince of Wales." The Prince of Wales took another royal tour of the Orient in 1869, but very few photographs were taken, with the exception of portraits. There was a preference then for the immediacy, romance and color of watercolor painting over the precision of photography. Through their display at world exhibitions during the second half of the 19th century and their circulation in photographic studios, photographs of the Middle East were widespread. The medium provided almost everyone with a tantalizing glimpse of the Orient. The Greek brothers, Georges and Constantin Zengati, or Zengati Frères, were the first commercial photographers to produce large-scale images of Egypt and Algeria. Like many of their contemporaries, their photographs were commonly found in tourists' souvenir albums, assembled in the Middle East in the last quarter of the 19th century. Their studio in Port Said, north of the Suez Canal, started in the mid-1880s, was well positioned to sell to tourists on the Grand Tour. The Zengakis specialized in photographing ancient monuments and scenes of everyday life. They occasionally worked with the Port Said photographer Hippolyte Arnoux, documenting work taking place on the Suez Canal, and Atta will be talking about that soon. This photograph here, taken by the brothers Zengati, differs from Bedford's documentary image in that it presents an idyllic view of a far-off land with its indigenous people. It features a hazy, romanticized vision of the popular tourist site of the Great Pyramids, with palm trees and Egyptians in the foreground, satisfying the contemporary taste for exoticism in the West. Orientalist painters of the time would have often used photographs such as this to accurately render the details of buildings and landscapes. And this just makes a nice comparison with a painting by Jean-Léon Gérôme, also in the Clark Art Institute. And that's the end. I have one more photo to show of Zengati Frères with the similar view of the pyramids. This time we have a camel in the view. Thank you very much. On to the next.
Diana, would you like to continue? Oh, I'm going to share the screen now. Okay. 1 second, please. Okay. Perfect. So good evening, everyone. As Diana mentioned in her introduction, my name is Matthew DiBenedetto, and I am a student ambassador at the McMullen Museum and a senior art history major here at Boston College. Tonight, I'll be presenting on Karnak, Way of the Sphinxes, and the Pylon of Ugerxes II, excuse my pronunciation of that, a photography taken by Schroeder and Company circa 1870. After extensive research, unfortunately, I was unable to locate any pertinent information on Schroeder and Company's activities in Egypt. From the inscription on the photograph, we may be able to infer that Schroeder and Company was a photographic studio located in Zurich, engaging in expedition photography in Egypt. Given our limited information on the photographer and the background surrounding the creation of the photograph in question, I've chosen to utilize this photograph in a didactic manner, analyzing the ways in which it exemplifies Orientalism as defined by post-colonial critics and theorists. Edward Said's seminal 1978 publication, Orientalism, analyzes the West's historical, cultural, and political perceptions of the East, and it is of critical importance and usefulness to the study of Orientalism. I cannot understate the importance of Said's text to the field of post-colonial studies. Yet, since its publication over 40 years ago, Said's book has inspired a significant body of criticism and critique of scholars across the political spectrum. Given the complexity of these critiques, many of which do only serve to enhance and nuance Said's thesis, the limited time that we have to present tonight, and the introductory nature of this presentation, I've decided to analyze this photograph solely using a Saidian model of Orientalism. So before we move forward, I think it's necessary to take a moment to introduce Said's definition of Orientalism as it relates to the study undertaken in his famous monograph. So, in Said's own words, Orientalism is the style of thought based upon an ontological and epistemological distinction made between the Orient and, most of the time, the Occident. Thus, a very large mass of writers have accepted a basic distinction between East and West as the starting point for elaborate accounts concerning the Orient, its people, customs, mind, destiny, and so on. The phenomenon as Orientalism, as I study it here, deals principally not with a correspondence between Orientalism and the Orient, but with the internal consistency of Orientalism and its ideas about the Orient, despite or beyond any correspondence or lack thereof with a real Orient. So, end quote. So ultimately, Said views Orientalism, and again, this is in his own words, as a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. And now, I know that's a lot, so we'll take a second to break down Said's theoretical understanding of Orientalism. So, in his view, Orientalism is a widespread perception of the distinction, both in an ontological and epistemological sense, between the Orient, which is considered the East, and the Occident, the West. Now, these aren't necessarily geographic regions as more as he describes as imaginary geography. So remember, this is kind of a perception of the difference between these two entities. So the essence, the very fabric of being composing the Orient, the East, and the Occident, the West, are perceived as being disparate, styling a binary opposition between East and West. So accepting the premises of this dichotomy, artists have utilized this inventive perception as the basis for accounts, both visual and written, of the culture and peoples of the Orient for a European audience, often resulting in erroneous or misleading representations of the Orient. So this here, let's relate this to photography now. So in an Orientalist photograph, as we will see in an analysis of the photograph displayed on your screen very soon, the formal elements of the composition are the manifestation of this perceived distinction or difference between the Orient and the Occident, serving the other, the peoples and cultures of the Orient, as a way to justify Europe's imperialistic practices in the Middle East. So, to afford some historical context on the nature of expedition photography of Egypt, building on what Diana has said before me, in 1839, at the introduction of Louis Daguerre's daguerreotype, the first publicly available photographic process, so introducing that to the French Chamber of Deputies, Dominique Francois Arago expounded, and I quote, the extraordinary advantages that could be derived from so exact and rapid a means of reproduction. And he's talking about this specifically in the context of archaeology, specifically archaeology in Egypt and the study of hieroglyphics. So, as Ali Begdad, a professor of English and comparative literature at UCLA, has demonstrated, there is an undeniable link between the history of photography and Europe's knowledge of the Middle East. Indeed, European photographers, often with governmental support, traveled to the Middle East, accompanying archaeological expeditions to build up a body of work depicting Egyptian antiquity. As we move into a visual analysis of the photograph before you, I think it's critical to acknowledge that these expeditions and the ensuing photography are not solely the result of an apolitical desire for knowledge. Of course, I'm sure that's a factor in this, but it would be too simplistic of an explanation of the factors of that surround the creation of this photography. Frankly, it would be irresponsible to analyze these pictures without acknowledging their intrinsic connection to European imperialistic efforts in the Middle East during the 19th century. So let's move into our photograph now. Depicted in this photograph, we are shown ruins of the Way of the Sphinx and this gateway here at the Karnak temple complex. So this is located near modern day Luxor in Egypt. So that's south of Cairo, and that would be considered, I believe, the upper Nile River because they're essentially inverted, upper and lower are inverted. So Karnak was a religious center of the ancient city of Thebes and a site of a massive temple complex begun during the Middle Kingdom. So that's 2000 to 1700 BCE, with additions being added through the Ptolemaic period. So that's 300 to 30 BCE. So this is an incredibly a large amount of time. So this is a massive and complex um, site essentially, and it really is huge. It's hectaacres, 20 hectaacres, I believe. So, given the massive size and the cultural significance of this site, and frankly its complexity, uh, it's no wonder that there was widespread photographic depictions on the site beginning in the mid 19th century in relationships to the study of Egyptian antiquity. So, although the inscription on this photograph mentions the location of the scene, we are really unaware of the context in which it was taken. However, given the figures encountered in the scene, I believe we can infer that this was taken amidst an archaeological expedition with the European archaeologist captured sitting to the right of the composition, and you could see him there sitting quite dignified. So now let's take a closer look at the formal qualities of this photograph. So I think the first thing that sticks out to me is really the juxtaposition of the native Egyptian, of the indigenous Egyptian people being depicted here in what would be considered, what is, considered traditional dress versus this kind of, and I quote this, modern, as perceived by European, the dress of the archaeologist. So he's wearing a bush jacket and a plinth hat, which themselves in our modern kind of cultural consciousness have become really also intrinsically associated with colonialist and imperialistic practices during this period. So this essentially serves to fulfill Europe's desire and expectation of the East as this exotic, romantic land that eventually plays into these ideas or the kind of systems of power that underlie um, European imperialism and colonialism. I also think that the separation of the Egyptian figures and the European figure is really interesting. There clearly is a compositional divide going on there with the Egyptian figures being in the road and the European figure being to the right there, kind of on the side of the road. So I find this separation really interesting because it's mimicking this perceived binary opposition between East and West as is perceived in the idea of Orientalism. So this is what we talked about and what was posited by Said before, that their very essence, their very being is different. I believe this is almost a visual representation of Orientalism here, and I wonder the intentionality of the photographer in this, because this photo seems quite posed. So I think that's something to keep in mind. What I think is the most significant, however, is the ancient ruins that are being depicted. So, we could see the sphinxes are almost destroyed. They're kind of strewn around on the pathway, broken, needing conservation. And essentially, yeah, there's really no evidence of any modernity or industrialism. And essentially, it's this kind of crumbling scene. Of course, with the exception of what would be considered the European figure, at least from a European perspective, as him being the only modern element in this. So, from the European perspective, seeing a photograph like this kind of gives the idea of this once mighty ancient empire that is now depicted as out of time or in a continual state of decay. Of course, this is completely erroneous, and these pictures are often obscure the very vibrant society of 19th century Egypt, and goes on to justify these European colonialist endeavors. Egypt and the Middle East is ready to be civilized, and notice the quotes above that, and modernized by the so-called benevolent European governments. Um, so although these photographs like this are important to the history of photography, viewing this photograph through the lens of Orientalism and post-colonial theory, we better understand how it promotes and upholds European colonialism and imperialism in the Middle East. This picture, by othering the Orient, so separate, kind of othering it from a Western perspective, so by the kind of mechanisms going on in this picture, it's being like separated from the West and creating that kind of binary. So the picture, by othering the Orient in its erroneous depiction as a backwards and dilapidating land in need of civilizing, as opposed to the Occident, a civilized land steeped in modernity that is ready to benevolently afford its magnificence upon the world. This is what supported the system of powers that were upheld European dominance over the world at this time. So at its core, tonight's event centers around the wider discourse in the field of art history on the ethics of representation. As you engage with the visual arts in your daily lives, I encourage you all to think critically about what these works of art are representing and how they are representing forms. Often the images we encounter in daily life are more than meet the eye. Thank you.
Hi, that's going to be really tough to follow, but it's nice to see you all. My name is Peyton Wilson. I'm a junior student ambassador at the McMullen, and I'm also a co-chair of the Collections Management Committee with Matt and Ethan. And I'm really excited to be presenting this photograph today because I think it's a really compelling image that prompts us to look a little deeper, as Matt said, and as art historians should, at the historical context of photographs. So while the photographer isn't known for this piece, we do know based on an inscription that it was taken sometime around the 1870s on a street in Algiers. So if you could go to the next slide. So at this time, Algeria was the oldest French holding in North Africa and a holding that eventually became a settler colony. And so Algiers in particular, which you can see I've outlined with a little red box at the top, it was a great French testing ground for ethnographic data and theories of race. And so if you don't know, ethnography and ethnology, or writing or describing the characteristics of people, emerged as a science in Europe in the late 18th century. And by the 1820s and 30s, the Ethnological Society in Paris had dedicated itself to, quote, pursuing the physical organization, the intellectual and moral character, and the languages and historical traditions of specific peoples. And so during the 1880s and 90s, right kind of when this picture was taken, a large amount of negatives and prints were made all over the Middle East and North Africa. And so if you can imagine really big leather-bound albums, that was this age. So these popular collectible items in Europe, they called them travel albums. Pictures like this would be included in these, and it's because of this widespread circulation that questions of context and framing come into play, just as Matt and Diana talked about. So if you could go to the next slide. The same themes like the previous picture were depicted repeatedly by different photographers, and they catered to this French and European desire for, on one hand, an encounter with what was perceived to be this exotic and distant land, and then on the other hand, making the European citizen feel more connected to colonial holdings in other parts of the world. So this, as Matt said, this quote unquote othering of the colonial holdings created a divide between the West and everywhere else in the world. And with this French interest in ethnography, it undermined and took advantage of populations like those living in Algiers. And so 19th century photographs of men like this in the East and in North Africa tend to portray their lives as primitive, pre-industrial, and in need of European aid when, in fact, these cities were absolutely thriving cultures. And so the subjects of these travel album photographs were displayed as picturesque and exotic and desirable by the European, while also at the same time degenerate and in need of improvement. So if you could go to the next slide. Since 1840, the French presence in the colony of Algeria had relied on capitalist involvement in tourism. And so by the turn of the century, which is right after this photograph was taken, the French government was actually funding photography studios in East and North Africa. So views of street quarters like this in the Kasbah falsely emphasized that this Turkish reign in the Kasbah belonged to a past area and insinuated that a vibrant and fruitful future rested in French control. There's a guidebook quote that reads, "The Kasbah still has the same mysterious atmosphere. It resembles the primitive women whose veils only allow their eyes to be seen." And so this labeling by work and ethnicity erases all social interaction. And it turns this vibrant society into an ahistorical series of categories which existed simply to interest European tourists. And so because subjects like this go about business interrupted, the photograph seems to provide this privileged, authentic view of life. But as we know from a contemporary perspective, the background and surrounding situation are super unclear. So As you can see, the composition of this photograph, by closely cropping the frame to portray only an empty street and a solitary figure in what we perceive as pre-modern dress, the Algerian subject is isolated from any social or geographic context that would problematize the French presence at the scene. And so it's what happened during this French presence and this French colonization of Algeria and Algiers, more specifically, that I would like to leave you with. So before French rule, the Kasbah, which is where this picture was taken, contained a total of 166 religious-related buildings, including mosques and mausoleums. And the majority of these buildings were destroyed during the French occupation. So in 1862, which is just a few years before this picture, there were only 48 of these buildings remaining. And so many of them, of the remaining buildings, were converted into spaces with non-Islamic purposes, such as military barracks or Christian churches. And so I just like to leave you with that image of Algiers, which was a thriving city before French colonization. So as we continue to talk about Orientalism and the different issues that come with analyzing expedition photography through a contemporary and specifically Western lens. That's all I have.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Atta Chowdhury, and I'm a senior student ambassador at the McMullen. I'm also part of the Collections Management Committee and also work in the Marketing Committee. So the photograph I have chosen, as you can see, is titled Arabs Posing in Front of the Suez Canal at Suez City, taken in 1885. This photograph was taken by the Zengati Brothers, who Diana talked about, and we saw two fascinating photographs by them. So just to do a little brief introduction once again. So the Zengati Brothers were two brothers of Greek origin who were activist photographers in Egypt and Algeria between the periods 1860 and 1890. So they specialized in photographing ancient monuments and just scenes from everyday life, and their photographs were produced into prints for the tourist trade. And as Diana said, they occasionally worked with the Port Said photographer Hippolyte Arnaud on the project documenting the construction of the Suez Canal, which is important in our case because the photograph that you see is of workers in front of the Suez Canal in the city of Suez. I want to use this photograph to sort of address the historical context of the Suez Canal, as it was a very important waterway in Egypt and a significant site in the age of imperialism. More specifically, European nations such as Britain and France fought over control of the Suez Canal because it was a strategic waterway for imperialistic campaigns. And historians basically consider the history of the Suez Canal to be significant to the European imperialism in Africa, sort of the scramble for Africa, and British imperialism in India. Now, what's interesting is, other than the sort of events like Napoleon's early campaigns, Europeans generally had very little interest in Egypt until 1859, when the construction of the Suez Canal began. And Matt, if you can just switch over to the next slide for a second. So you can see that the Suez Canal, the map on the left, shows you that it's connected the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea. And this was an important moment in the Egyptian 19th century history because it saw the European nations take an increased interest in the Northern African region because basically it allowed for much shorter trips to Asia from Europe. As you can see on the right previously, ships would have to travel the entire way around Africa in order to make the journey to the Far East. But with the construction of the Suez Canal, this journey was made a lot easier and a lot quicker. And Matt, if you can just switch back to the last slide, please. Thank you. So this was especially significant at the time due to the age of imperialism and European interest in both India and China. And more specifically, the British had a keen interest in the Suez Canal due to their colonization in India, while the French were interested due to their control over regions in the South Pacific. Now, the opening of the Suez Canal sort of marked a period when the Orient was increasingly open and accessible to the West. So this is where Orientalism comes in. It sort of exerted a compelling allure almost on Western viewers, travelers, scholars, and entrepreneurs. And the 19th century Westerner was naturally fascinated with the Orient. And the Near East leg of a grand tour through Europe was facilitated by this 1869 completion of the canal. And so there were organized tours provided by Thomas Cook. And the opening of the canal basically provided more affordable access to the region. And therefore, there were tourists who were now not only aristocrats, but also upper middle class. So a lot more people gained access to this region. And the heightened frenzy of like Western leisure tours to the region was actually preceded by increased French and British colonial activity in the region. So there was a general sort of cultural fascination with the Orient, like archaeological explorations and political power struggles for the region. And this grew throughout the 19th century. So there was a buildup of interest in the Levant and Egypt, which actually coincided with the invention and evolution of photography. And British control over Egypt began in 1882. And this is more relevant to our discussion because this photograph is from 1885. So in 1882, basically Britain invaded and occupied Egypt in much part because of the Suez Canal. And there was a sort of anxiety to secure this imperial link with India, which seemed imperiled by the Egyptian disorder. So, and actually the troops didn't leave until 1956 after the Suez crisis happened. So many, many years later. And this is where I want to bring in Hippolyte Arnaud, who was a photographer who was documenting works on the Suez Canal. Although it's unclear as to when he actually traveled to Egypt, but it appears that he was working in Egypt at the same time as many of these photographers, like the Zengati Brothers. But there isn't much evidence as to like the precise nature of this relationship between the Zengati Brothers and Arnaud. But we don't know if maybe there was collaboration because this was later on in the 1880s. But this could have been a possibility. Now, what's interesting in terms of Orientalism and imperialism is that there was no real attempt on the part of the colonizers to argue that the canal was beneficial to Egypt. And many sort of millions were spent on the canal with not much effect for Egypt, not many consequences for Egypt. Just, I guess, like more traffic to pass through their country without actually benefiting them. In fact, Egyptians who were involved in the building of this canal, they were on very, very dangerous ground during this construction. There was a high potential for disaster, which continued long after. So even into the 1880s, when this photograph was taken, it was quite like dangerous for these workers who were working on this canal. And even in the 1880s, Port Said was still devoid of warehouses for oil or other inflammable materials. And merchants in oil had to leave their full crates on the eastern side of the canal, which were exposed to the weather and many possible accidents. And what's interesting is that this photograph possibly shows these workers. We don't see many photographs of this darker side of the construction of this dangerous ground that they were working on. And even though the canal was completed by the help of Egyptian labor and capital from which the whole commercial world gained from more than Egypt did, it's Egypt that suffered from the monopoly of this land. And the Suez Canal is basically a symbol of British and French imperialism and the desire of the West to use it to gain aspect to the more romantic aspects of the so-called Orient, which can be seen in the depictions of the canal in the photograph. Yeah.
We can move on. Great. Hello, my name is Ethan Starr. I am also a collections manager here at the McMullen Museum alongside Mr. Matt, and I will be presenting on another photograph today. For this final work related to the themes we've been exploring today, I'd like to apply some of these understandings and means of scrutiny to a more recent work of photography, a work for which, for those present who are longtime supporters of the McMullen Museum and who maintain particularly excellent memory, may recall from a 1996 exhibition here at the museum in which it was featured. I chose this work to present today because in my capacity as a photographer of the permanent collections here at the McMullen Museum, I encountered this and the several other works of Avraham Hayes' photography held in our collections earlier this semester as part of my work to capture new photographs of our collections for use in our online databases. I began looking further into this photograph and its sister works when, to my surprise, I realized they were taken as recently as the late 1980s. Its creator, Avraham Hay, is an Israeli professional photographer employed in architectural photography, documentary photography for a number of books, including some I found in the library, and art photography, in both the sense of artistic creation and, like me, documenting museum collections. This work, The Wilderness of Sinai, has remained at the McMullen Museum after being featured in that 1996 exhibition at Boston College in collaboration with the Tel Aviv Museums of Art. The exhibition was entitled J.M.W. Turner and the Romantic Visions of the Holy Land and the Bible. Hay's photographs were taken with the intention of hanging alongside Turner's engravings of the Holy Land, mirroring their perspectives in depicting various locations throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. In Turner's engraving of the same name, can we go to the next slide? Thank you. In Turner's engraving of the same name, which you can see alongside the photograph here, he represents Mount Sinai and the plain of Rephidim and a rock that may have once been a cliff higher up on the mountain. It is the location where, as told in Exodus, Moses gave the Decalogue to the Jews. Speaking here in the words of the 1996 exhibition catalog, the large single rock in the foreground was called the Stone of Moses, or Meribah, meaning in Hebrew, dispute. Turner, or perhaps the participants of the Grand Tour pilgrimages that were providing the sketches for the artist, chose this location to depict as the spot in which Moses struck the rock and allowed water to gush forth, supplying the thirsty Israelites and etching a channel in the rock. It is referenced in the Psalms as the crag from which Moses made streams flow and brought the waters forth in the rivers. I have a few more photos, though, from this same collection, which were featured in the same exhibition. We'll scroll through here. Next, we have Jerusalem from the Latin Convent, and I was able to find the original painting from Turner here in the bottom left. And again, you can see how little has changed from the days when lots of romantic painters, not just Turner, were coming through this area, or in the case of Turner, looking at the documents others brought back from this region and doing their best to recreate biblical scenes. Next, we have a scene of Mount Moriah, in which they're able to reproduce pretty much the same perspective. And then next is Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. And finally, a work, a panoramic work, which I assume was also in the exhibition. We can ask Professor Netzer at the end if she remembers, but didn't seem to have an analog among Turner's works. But we have it at the McMullen. If we can do one more slide change. Okay, back to our original. Now this photograph allows us an opportunity to probe the sort of outer limits of the ideas of Orientalism that we've already been discussing, and our other panelists have already given a great summary of. After all, its photographer is not a resident of some faraway country, but the nearby state of Israel. Yet traveling to this location would not have been the result of a long expedition, but traversing the Sinai would undoubtedly involve the crossing of some politically sensitive boundaries, and we needn't dismiss the more contemporary, somewhat perilous political situation of the region in how we view a work like this today. That said, as it is to some degree an imitation of the earlier engravings of Turner, it is important to acknowledge the sense in which the approach of Hay's photography is both indebted and indicative of that of his earlier romantic counterpart. In looking to capture the scenes that Turner had rendered without having ever traveled to the region himself, I'm referring to Turner there. Hay is working in a documentary function, focused on reproducing the facts on the ground and relying on photography to convey those facts. In a sense, The goal is little different than that of the other photographers that we've featured today. The question we pose today is what the artist seeks to convey beyond simply the more literal details of the work. Some questions arise immediately. Why does Hay opt for a black and white format? Is it to resemble the engravings of Turner or for other reasons? Did he proceed with the intention of making his photographs resemble those of other 19th century interlopers? By that I mean photographers, considering it looks rather similar. The particular contents of the wilderness of Sinai, however, provides interesting fodder for considering these additional meanings and additions on atop the perspective of earlier artists like Turner. The addition of the church, which of course happened maybe not after Turner's time, but it wasn't in his engraving for whatever reason. He left it out, of course, because, well, he's depicting biblical scenes. But we're seeing it here, we should situate ourselves when we view this piece within the Sinai Peninsula through the camera of an Israeli photographer. And that poses further questions that are more characteristic, perhaps, of the post-colonial era. What are we to make of the fact that we have a church depicted here, of the different claims from both biblical times all the way to the present, considering national boundaries and where we can situate ourselves within geopolitical struggles? What are we to make of the different claims on not just this rock, but this rock is a symbol for the region more generally? And in that, through that interpretation, I think this this photograph, even if it wasn't meant to be a standalone piece, can provide some more meaning for the present.